I failed most of the goals that I set out for myself at the beginning of this year. I did pretty well at the things that popped up along the way, but not without paying the price in stress and stagnation. I've talked about systems before on this channel, and they've worked, usually for months at a time, but I gradually made them too rigid and procedural to be useful. I tried to turn all of the necessary work into habit, which did not work out in the way that I had hoped. The lesson that I had learned far too late is one that CGP Grey touches on in his video on yearly themes, which is that making fulfilling material progress requires consistent work, effort, and intentions. Habits and systems have their place to preserve those, but they're ultimately safety nets. For whatever reason, I had a really hard time with both living in the moment and planning or thinking beyond the next day. At the same time, I never let go of an obsession with productivity, all the while making excuses for procrastination, cramming, and doom scrolling without addressing the root causes of that kind of behavior. The result was an inevitable cycle of burning out, making excuses about my systems to avoid uncomfortable work, and then pushing too hard to make up for it, starting the cycle all over again. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the things that have and probably will continue to give me the most bang for my buck on the level of intentions, expectations, and perspective. Part 1. Calendars. Deadlines, time blocks, and finding the time to live. Before getting into what we should do, we should talk about what we should avoid. I used to try to plan my day down to 10-minute intervals and then to stick to it. The problem here was that my mind is flexible and in fact does not care about what it used to say a few hours ago. Once you realize that the only punishment for breaking from a strict schedule is self-imposed and arbitrary, it becomes way easier to ignore all of your time blocks as everything begins to feel like noise. It was also extremely easy for me to structure my day with the assumption that I would always be in the same state of mind at the same time every day, and to ignore scheduling things to support my health with the assumption that I would just find the time for it. All of that compounded with the fact that I was far too ambitious. A typical person can perform an average of 4 hours of high quality deep work per day, and willpower is a fatigable resource. Both of these facts were easily forgotten when I was chronically underprepared and trying to do everything at once, trying to meet 100 different deadlines. So many times I've watched the hours tick by while trying to force my brain to fit a schedule while letting work that I was better suited for at the moment fall to the wayside. Given that I'm quick to forget things and heavily biased towards solving the problems that feel most immediate, I need a calendar to keep everything running. At the same time, I need to ensure that I don't start viewing the calendar's job as doing the work for me. So what am I doing here? I will still be time blocking, but I need to be more realistic about my time. There are things that need to happen every day, like sleep, meals, and commuting. These are foundational, non negotiable time blocks that need to be accounted for. Beyond just survival, there's a necessity for taking time to meaningfully rest and recuperate. These exist for me at the boundaries of different kinds of work and context switches. The point is to prime my brain and temper my expectations of each day by making the stuff I need to survive and thrive obvious and non negotiable. On my current calendar, that looks like these blocks here. These cannot be changed, cannot be avoided. We will talk about the symbols before every block in a moment. Not everything on the calendar is equally important, and part of my mistake was viewing it as so. I don't want to keep this in my head and I don't want it set in stone either, so I need an easy way to indicate the priority and scope of action for my time blocks that isn't just a numerical linear ranking. I've been using ligature bullets to easily read and modify how I view different time blocks. The syntax here is to use a priority glyph followed by a scope glyph before the block's name to communicate to myself both my expectations and what's needed of me to adhere to that time block's demands. On my calendar, that looks like this, giving me a quick view on what I can afford to move around and what I can't. I also have a handful of habits that need to happen regularly that I can't bother with occupying brain space for since they're not mentally complex or socially demanding in any way. Things like skincare, making sure my pets are alright, chores that are infrequent, all of that stuff is a kind of deadline for me. For recurrences, deadlines, and events, I make heavy use of full day entries that I assign multiple reminders that notify me either on my phone or my ThinkPad. I usually time these around my boundary and foundation blocks that share the same kind of context to remove as much friction as possible. At the same time, I keep them as full day entries to make sure that I'm always seeing the things that are important and that I ought to keep my mind on. Part 2: Periodic notes and setting intentions that work. It's not enough for me to just read a calendar and figure out what I want to do. There's just too much complexity for a calendar to capture and account for everything. I regularly lose sight of my priorities and I tend to procrastinate, so to ward against that, I have a set of different notes that I take about what's happened to me and what I plan to do next at different frequencies. As you can see, there are two axes that I care about, one of which is how actionable the intentions set within each note are, and the other being how stable against forgetting my thinking has to be. Daily notes are immediately action oriented and volatile, which makes it great for writing morning pages, collecting open loops from my head, figuring out what priming methods are going to work, what my priorities for the day are, and taking incident reports throughout the day to catch what felt especially good or bad, and following a chain of asking why to find the conditions and actions that have the most impact on the subjective feeling of my daily life. I'm also experimenting with using my daily notes to track my habits since I can feed the data into some Python or JavaScript program to create pretty charts like you can find on GitHub or MonkeyType. Moving on to weekly notes, these are more intention forward and a little less volatile than daily notes, so I use them primarily as a review tool. I take them at the end of a week, compiling any incident reports from the daily notes, rating myself on how I feel about different areas of my life, and figuring out how to cope or digest with any anxieties and distractions that might come my way. I've also pretty consistently been doing the n plus or minus 1 exercises, which take that subjective rating from earlier and ask two questions. Why didn't I rate this one lower? And what does a single rank higher look like? Monthly notes are where the focus shifts almost entirely from setting intentions to deeper set reflection. I take monthly notes at the end of each month, usually over a few days, by skimming all of my daily notes and weekly notes from that month and then doing three things. The first two are practices from the books The Greatness Mindset and The Alter Ego Effect, which are both pretty schlocky and repetitive self help books that nonetheless have a handful of meaningful takeaways between the two of them. From the Greatness Mindset, I adapted a rubric for judging my areas of life, getting a GPA between 1 and 10 at the end of it all. While the weekly notes do a more subjective rating, this one is meant to be a little more objective and shed light on prioritizing my behaviors. The rubric questions in order are whether I am getting the results that I want, whether I am feeling good about that area, whether I am doing it for the right reasons, whether I am actively doing things that support my ability to act, and whether I am pushing and exploring my comfort zone with plans of improvement. The alter ego effect has this notion of taking notes to define an ordinary world consisting of the things you want to stop or do less of, and an extraordinary world consisting of the things you want to keep doing, start, or to do more of. I disagree with the language here. Ordinary and extraordinary carry some connotational luggage that causes me to burn out faster, and I'm a big fantasy tabletop role playing game guy, so I like using the terms banality and glamour from the Changeling line of World of Darkness games. The exercises are essentially the same, though. The last thing I do each month is consider what I can control. This can pretty quickly turn into a downward spiral of doomerism if you're not careful, but at this point in the note, I tend to already be thinking about what I should do. This is meant to be something of an anxiety blacklist, consciously recognizing those factors that I can't do anything about and therefore can't be afforded a lot of mental resources. Moving on to quarterly notes, despite them being on a longer time scale than the monthly notes, I find them a little more actionable. I use quarterly notes to set intentions, identify some metrics that I can use to evaluate future notes, and to set some soft priorities for myself as time goes on. I tend to overdo my hobbies on any given month, so I try to use these notes to kind of narrow the list for a while, like a seasonal approach to my hobbies. Here, I spend the most time on metrics, which I view as having three types: leading, lagging, and progression. These can also be called indicators. Leading indicators are process oriented, things that are actionable and repeatable over a long timescale consistently. Lagging indicators are results oriented, things that let me know how I'm stacking up to some external standard or how the world is reacting to me. Differentiating between the two can save a whole lot of stress, but your mileage may vary. The last type of metric that I use is a progression indicator, which are quantitative and numbers. These are things like steps taken, words or lines of code written, tasks closed, time spent with friends, all of that. You can measure these whenever you want, but I tend to do it on a daily basis, like as I was mentioning earlier, like tracking habits on the daily note. The point of this last one is not to necessarily gain a sense of information or perspective, but to build confidence that I am doing the right thing. As I'm sure we all know, yearly notes and annual resolutions are almost entirely unactionable. I don't think they can even be used to set goals or projects, which, rules out resolutions, as I mentioned. Instead, I use the yearly note to set themes, as described by CGP Grey. Guideposts, more than anything, I use themes to steer myself towards emotionally salient experiences that can hopefully induce some more long term change by giving my brain a narrative to latch onto. I also want to make a habit of continually revisiting these yearly notes, checking in on whether my theme is holding strong and making changes and commitments as my situation and context evolves. Part 3. Time logs. I've been using the Clog time tracking tool since the latter half of this year, 2024, and I found it much cleaner and more extensible than what I've been using prior, which was Toggle. Clog sells itself on a fully human readable plain text format with a simple tag oriented categorization system. The point of time logs is to gain a sense of objectivity and understanding how I spend my time and what I'm actually doing with myself. I've experimented with a few different formatting methods to communicate that as best as possible, but I've recently settled on trying this one, which relies entirely on the tags and tag values that I can then search and feed into scripts to process. I have an area of life shortened into a typically 3 character shorthand with an optional value to specify the activity that I'm doing itself. For example, I can have like an academia area with a homework or study activity. This is then followed by the source of action, either motivation, ambition, emotion, habit, or willpower, and an outcome that is positive, neutral, negative, and then a focus as to whether I am doing this for the sake of my past, my present, or my future. And I typically review this weekly and then monthly. If I had to recommend an order of implementation, I would recommend a calendar before periodic notes, before a time log. But any combination of two from these three is likely to provide some insight and value for your life as long as you are engaging with them actively and with known intentions. This is ultimately a personal project and a personal system, so your mileage may vary. Thank you for watching so far. If you have been, this channel is a shot in the dark for the year, and I've learned a lot about some personal do's and don'ts for content creation in particular. I have a plan for 2025, but who knows how I'll have to adapt to future content.